Okay. Okay. So I guess I'll kick things off if that's okay, Jared. Welcome everyone, and I think this is my first meeting as your new co-chair along with Jared. So I just want to thank everyone, and I'm really looking forward to working more closely with this group. I was definitely very honored to be asked, and really excited about the work that this subcommittee is doing. So I hope to be able to support your efforts well. So we just, Marion just put the minutes from our January 19th meeting in the chat. So I guess we can pause to see if anyone has any questions or comments about those minutes. And if not, then we can move on, assuming that they are good with everyone. Okay. So we do have 2 hours scheduled for today, but I'm not sure that we'll fill the 2 hours, but we may. There's a lot of meaty things to discuss here. So the first item that we have is to review the requests for information responses that we received on the life cycle analysis, and just to remind folks that all the responses that we received are on the climate change website. The PDF links are there. So hopefully folks had a chance to take a look at those in advance, but I'm going to turn it over to Jared to review those responses.
Thanks, Megan. And I don't know if they are elsewhere. It looks like they actually just got put in the chat by Jane or Marion, but the easiest way that I found them was just going to the calendar and looking at today's meeting, and you can see both the agenda and those attachments of the RFIs that were received. So yeah, so the update is that we received 5 responses to our request for information about life cycle greenhouse gas emissions analysis related to energy use in Vermont. And so we had a task group, the same greenhouse gas task group of this subcommittee that has been meeting, throughout the year, met to initially review those last week and have some discussions about some possible next steps that we wanted to share with this subcommittee. And so I will attempt to summarize that conversation and some of those proposed next steps, but others who have been involved, please feel free to jump in if you think I'm missing something or misstating something. But just so folks have a sense, that task group has included Megan and myself and Richard. And then we've also, Jane has been involved, as has Colin Smythe from Department of Environmental Conservation. And we've had Jeff Merrill participating as well, who's been really helpful. He helped design the RFI and has done a lot of work in this space in the past. So I apologize if I accidentally missed somebody on the list, but I think that's our group.
Brian Woods has been helping us as
Brian,
well.
Yes. Thank you so much. So that group met to review the RFIs, and here are some of the key takeaways. One is, there was a variety or some variation in the quality of the responses, but there were some very high quality responses that gave us confidence that this is an area that a number of organizations have looked carefully at and have some really good recommended approaches, and there's good precedents, including the ways that other states have approached this. But I think it was also really helpful that we saw in the RFI responses that, there were no 2 responses were exactly the same when we talked about the definitions for life cycle emissions or for upstream emissions. There was broad overlap, but I think that what we found in those responses is that it's going to be really helpful to us in terms of getting to clear definitions and bounding the analysis in a way that we can all agree on. So I think, speaking for that task group, what we felt was the responses to that RFI shed a lot of light, gave us a lot of helpful information, gave us confidence that there are organizations out there that could really help us in this. And so our hope would be to move forward with designing an RFP, a request for proposals based on those responses, to be able to frame up a scope of work. And the big outstanding question is the budget from which to do that work. And I would invite Jane or Julie or others to speak about this, but my sense is, we had a council meeting where we discussed kind of the existing obligated funds, the kind of funds that have not been obligated that may be available for some of the additional research and analysis. There were some counselors who advocated that roughly $100,000 left in unobligated funds be prioritized for just such a life cycle RFP. We did not come to a final decision on that at the council meeting, but we did agree that question would be taken up at the next steering committee meeting on April 4th at 11:30, Monday, April 4th, and council members will be welcome to participate. It's clear to me that this is the type of analysis and information we are going to need eventually. I think, and I'm just speaking for myself here, I don't want to speak for others, both to be confident that we are complying with the Global Warming Solutions Act and anticipating many of the recommendations that the Climate Action Plan makes, including the clean heat standard, that speak to life cycle emissions. So I do think that it is important that we find a way to move forward, but I do think we can't have kind of final clarity until a decision is made about those funds. But let me pause there to see if there's anything that folks from the task group want to add, or if there's any questions from the subcommittee. Jane, please go ahead.
Well, I'm not exactly sure the best time to sort of go through the next steps, but I did just want to suggest a few other comments that we discussed when the task group last met and ongoing conversations that they and our staff have had since that meeting. So one, I just wanted to say that I think we all feel like as the RFI, as we think about transitioning it to an RFP, if the steering committee approves or recommends that as the highest priority for our remaining funding, that we feel like the task group needs to be a bit broader than just science and data staff. So wanted to suggest that I've already reached out to the Public Service Department, Claire and TJ, to see if there could be a touch point with the Public Service Department, knowing that much of the life cycle analysis that you referred to for the clean heat standard is really tasked to the PSD. So hoping that we'll have capacity from PSD to help support the oversight of the RFP and whatever the discrete components of life cycle analysis we do through the GWSA budget, knowing that it won't be everything and that likely there'll need to still be additional perhaps life cycle analyses that further look at things in the clean heat standard space. And then second, other representation feels because of the biomass task group, as well as the interest and ongoing work in the biomass space by the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee. Friday, when they meet, we'll be offering the opportunity for a representative from Ag and Eco to sit on that RFP development and review as we cautiously sort of move that way, knowing that the funding hasn't been allocated yet to that. Yeah, and then I'll just say that I do think the RFIs were really interesting, and the fact that no one consultant gave us the same definition, I think. Now I met with Megan and others in DEC, Colin, this morning to talk about how we could frame the RFP, because we'd like to propose, as we cautiously move forward, putting together an outline for the RFP now that would then come together around with the more robust task group around it to look at what our proposal would be. And one of those things is to pick a definition for our analysis in the RFP. just interesting to me, and interesting to continue to hear the reflections of folks like Brian and Colin and Megan, who know a lot more about, and Jeff and Jared, who all know a lot more about this than I do, and just how far we could go with this, and appreciating what's really within scope and what we have capacity to do with the amount of money we have, because we have $100,000 for this. So just that the process, I think, is still continuing and evolving, and we look forward to having additional input from PSD staff and Ag and Eco staff too.
Sorry, Jean, that was a good reminder. I just touched base with TJ. I think I'll plan to participate for now, and we're still figuring out who from PSD, but there's definitely intention to have someone involved. So yeah, so loop me in for now and we'll go from there.
Thank you so much, Claire.
I think that sounds great. And thank you, Jane, for that update. Agree with all of it. The only other kind of perspective that I would mention that I think could be valuable on that broader task group would also be the chance to ask the Public Utilities Commission if there is somebody on staff who will be looking at some of the life cycle analysis questions there, or if that has already happened and it's been clear that the PSD, I know there is clear work between those entities, but I think that's another question, is because eventually it is likely that if the clean heat standard goes into effect, that a lot of the analysis to underlie it, to assess the different clean heat measures, et cetera, will, and there are roles for both the PUC and the PSD. And so I think it would be good to just make sure that that communication is happening as well.
Yeah, Jared, we had talked about that as well, and Brian Woods kind of highlighted that as something that we might want to consider to not necessarily increase the scope of this current project, but just kind of keep it in mind so that this can be useful potentially towards that effort should the clean heat standard pass and become a new program. And so I think we're maybe looking for, Claire's or her colleagues to weigh in terms of how we might be able to do that. And because and Claire, correct me if I'm wrong, or others, but it's my understanding that currently in the clean heat standard, there's going to be additional resources to the department and to the commission to kind of build capacity to do the work. And so if it does make sense to loop someone in from the commission, or if, the public service department envisions that they're going to be taking the lead on the life cycle work. I know that it's assigned to the technical advisory group within the bill, the way the bill is drafted now. So it's like a whole group of people, including A&R as well. But yeah, I think it would be great to know, what the vision is for that work so that we can try to have, the right people at the table now, like I said, not necessarily to increase the scope, but just to be thoughtful about its usefulness.
Yeah, I think we're going to have timing challenges, and just want to make sure that talking about timeline is also part of what's being discussed here. Obviously, the clean heat standard still under development in the legislature and has a ways to go. I think it has an effective date of July 1st. There are a number of staff positions envisioned in the clean heat standard, as well as that technical advisory committee, but I have a hard time believing all of those sort of roles will be filled out probably much before the end of this calendar year. And so, want to be as efficient in our work as possible, both accomplishing what we need to do, but also making sure that whatever we're doing is an effective building block for what might be required as part of the clean heat standard. And so it may ultimately slow this piece down a little bit, but I think it's probably in service of the greater good.
Agreed. I guess the question would just be if there's any other feedback or questions on that. I do think the next steps will be kind of trying to form that broader task group, and I defer to you, Megan, on the kind of process and timeline around kind of initial drafting of an RFP. Clearly, we'll know more after the steering committee meeting as well. But those seem like the most obvious kind of next steps.
Yeah, I think we decided earlier today that Brian and Jeff are going to work together to do some kind of just initial building of a potential draft RFP in preparation for getting that funding potentially at the beginning of next month. So they've started that work, and I think, should we have a clear picture of funding at the beginning of next month, then that effort will, kind of kick into a higher gear at that point. And we can review a draft from Brian and Jeff, I think, shortly after that.
So I think unless there's any other questions or comments on that topic, and if there are, please feel free to speak up, folks, but otherwise happy to, I think it's over to you, Megan, for the next agenda item.
Sure. So this is, I think, just as we were thinking in particular about an update from the biomass working group, but also wanted to have some space here for any other liaisons for other subcommittees to give updates. So I will invite others to weigh in first if there's any updates for this group from liaisons.
Megan, this is Richard. Could you just take a moment to describe what you mean by biomass? I know this is a really basic question.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
The question was, what do we mean by biomass? What's in scope? Do we understand that clearly?
I think that is one of the questions that has been unresolved to date, Richard, because
Well, maybe that's why I'm having to ask the question then.
I mean, I know that one of the points on which the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee did not reach consensus was the definition of biomass itself, but Jane, you have more perspective there, so feel free to jump in.
I just put in the chat the definition that was used around the development of the tabled actions. That is the basis for the task group. At the top of those tabled actions, it refers to a definition that that group was using. And so that is it.
So that, just quickly scanning that doesn't include, for example, construction debris. It doesn't include waste grease from restaurants. It doesn't include biomass from manure systems on farms.
No, it is very, I would say that this definition has been the focus of their conversation.
Okay, well, that's
None
helpful.
of those others have come up. Mm-hmm.
But that's helpful, but those other kinds of biomass-like material could also be important, and they need to be addressed somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, again, Jane, chime in, but I think that the question of biofuels more generally are being addressed in various groups at this point in different contexts. And I know that it was, obviously addressed at the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee actions and recommendations in the plan.
So, yeah, yes, one could argue that we haven't taken a comprehensive approach to especially biofuels throughout the climate action plan. But I'll just start with where we're at with this work group, perhaps. The task group that worked on biomass in the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, so brought forward a suite of actions that the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee never had time, never were able, for a number of reasons, to reach consensus on those actions. And rather than omit them completely, they made a choice to forward them on to the full council with a disclaimer that said just that consensus was not reached by the subcommittee. The council chose, rather than including them or deferring them, chose to table them and recommend within the CAP, and I can put the direct language from the CAP, around the formation of a task group that would include members from multiple subcommittees, appreciating that cross-sector in particular had a very, very much a role to play in crafting what these recommendations would look like, as does science and data, would put together a task group and actually did spell out in the climate action plan, for better or worse, that the starting point for that task group would be the tabled actions. And from the tabled actions, they would work to put forward a new recommendations for the council to consider on a timeline, a fairly quick timeline of the spring. I think that we're all appreciating that timeline is challenging. I think there's also a question with the task group around what has been settled, sort of speak, by other recommendations in the climate action plan, especially in terms of thermal energy and the use of wood for thermal energy, and what is still within scope here. And also, I should have said, in addition to what's been settled, where new information is clearly needed that's forthcoming, that should require us perhaps to pause on this work till we have it, AKA the life cycle analysis in this space. And so the subcommittee's first cross-sector, who met last week, considered in this space what they as a subcommittee thought was within bounds of the space that they would think policy recommendations made sense, and to what information they would need in order to make those recommendations. Ag and ecosystems are meeting on Friday. They intend to have a similar conversation. And then the task group will meet within the next week or so to reconvene and see if there's consensus around the scope, and the scope being a list of the existing tabled actions that does just what I said earlier. It says, yes, this is within scope, but we need more information. We should wait to get that information, or we can get that information through task meetings and inviting in experts. And two, this has been settled via other recommendations in the climate action plan already. And so, yeah, I'll just say those meetings are being held in public. Unlike the other task groups, they've chosen that there's the benefit of having those in public, which is great. And again, it's ag and eco and cross-sector with 3 reps from each of those subcommittees. And then Megan's been representing science and data, and Colin's been there in a support role and will continue to be, I think, which is really great because of the role of the inventory as referenced in these actions. And then Richard, in the email that I sent around today about the task group, Jared has continued to remind me of your interest in this space, and felt like it was really appropriate to, if you wanted to join that task group too, that would make a lot of sense. And to date, we've kept it at existing subcommittee members, knowing though that there are a wealth of experts out there in biomass who are probably itching to be around the table to talk about these things. And the hope is, once the scope was refined, that experts could be invited in on their specialty, but that the task group itself would be comprised of existing subcommittee members in order to recognize that the recommendations ultimately have to come from a subcommittee up to the council, as the process that we've used historically in the last year.
Thank you, Jane.
Yeah.
Jay?
Yeah, I just wanted to give an update from Rural Resilience and Adaptation. So we met in January 25th, and we meet this Friday, and a lot of the work is focusing on the municipal vulnerability index, that RFP, and drafting that which is going to be soon going out the door. and just refining the scope of that. That's really been the thrust for us. And we're hoping to get that, I think, completed for this Friday. Is that right, Jane?
Yeah, the RFP for the Municipal Vulnerability Index is fully drafted, and we got great feedback from Jay and others on the subcommittee that I incorporated, and Marion posted with the agenda an updated draft RFP in that space. So I think the subcommittee will hopefully sort of sign off on it this Friday, and then there'll be internal routing questions, including capacity around how to run this through our own IT department, and whether or not this stays as an RFP or becomes an internal IT project. And I'm actually meeting with our internal IT folks tomorrow around both the Municipal Vulnerability Index and the Measuring and Assessing Progress database, which is also on the agenda for an update. But in addition to the Municipal Vulnerability Index, which has largely been focused on drafting of an RFP in that space with great input from diverse voices, Marion's been really hard at work and facilitating the climate toolkit development and that task group. And so, and I know Leslie Ann is participating in both of these conversations, and and they have a meeting tonight, a stakeholder meeting. So maybe Marion would like to give an update on that too, because that's relevant to rural resilience.
Yeah, happy to. And sorry, keeping my camera off because of internet. But as Jane said, there's a sort of one of the two big projects happening under rural resilience is one, the Municipal Vulnerability Index, and two, the Climate Toolkit, focused on really providing a hub of existing resources focused on climate action at the municipal level. So there's a focus group, or excuse me, a group of folks from rural resilience, as well as Leslie Ann, who have been meeting quite frequently over the past couple of months to start scoping that out. And we have a meeting this evening with primary audience members for that toolkit. So municipal officials and volunteers, regional planning commission staff, to think through what municipalities need in terms of access to tools and resources to tackle climate action at a municipal level, what they may have been missing and are looking for in a toolkit, and how we can best facilitate the development of that. So that's this evening, and we're continuing to engage with stakeholders on that and build that out as well.
I'll just say that both of these things, Marion's work and the Municipal Vulnerability Index, will really benefit from new subcommittee members on science and data, also who I know you're considering around resilience metrics. And it's exciting to see some of the nominations in that space.
All right.
I'm not sure. Oh. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm just going to invite any other updates.
Thanks, Megan. So as far as just transitions, and Marion and Jane can talk more about this, we're really trying to figure out a good way to support all of the other subcommittees. That's what we're working on, and the addition of new members as well, and new liaisons, and how we can better support the other subcommittees in making sure that the guiding principles are being adhered to, or at least looked at in some form, while trying to do everything else that you guys are doing. So that's what we're trying to see, the best way to do that.
Kashka shouldn't sell herself short either, because a lot of the work from the Just Transitions Committee is going to be displayed at UVM next Wednesday evening as part of a panel session that allows some of the lessons learned to be conveyed. And so Kashka is going to be on that panel with Beverly, Sue, and I believe Chris, right, Kashka?
Yes, I think Mona may be on that as well.
Okay, cool. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, as well. Thank you.
That's
All
great.
right.
I'm happy to give a short, I mean, Megan, you covered a lot of the kind of biomass task group discussion that happened in the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee last week, but there's a couple other things that came up there that I might just bring up so that everybody's aware of. One is, you hopefully saw from the email from Jane, there will be a webinar next Friday, April 1st from noon to 1:30 for the council and then any subcommittees and members of the public who want to engage in the discussion of the way forward on the transportation recommendations. And really glad that we're going to be doing that and looking at some of the options so that we can kind of get to greater clarity than we were able to end with the initial climate action plan. So I hope that any of you who are interested in the kind of how we meet our emissions reduction and equity goals in the transportation sector can join that important conversation next Friday from noon to 1:30. Jane, I don't know if you want to pause just to highlight some of the other upcoming events, a number of them which have been shared through the council list that I think for folks who are interested would be really beneficial to have participation. But
yeah, thank you. So the transportation webinar is a specific component of that task group and the ongoing outreach and engagement that task group wants to do to bring the council and the public along with the ongoing work in that space, which will lead to likely recommendations that will go up to the council this fall in that space. But there's also a public engagement strategy that Just Transitions task group is largely managing. And that consists of making the plan more accessible through translation services, through story map development, and some other components that A&R is helping to lead and facilitate. And then also talks about broad-based engagement as well as partner engagement. The broad-based engagement, we set up our first two and only planned two, I should say, online meetings for April 12th and April 13th. One is at lunchtime and one is in the evening, trying to offer different times to capture more people. And those are really focused on the ongoing work of the council. So there'll be a relatively short presentation about the CAP that'll really focus people on the work that's still happening through the council and subcommittees to garner feedback in breakout groups that would be productive and worthwhile for people to give to us about the priorities they see for the ongoing work in that space. And then the partner engagement is continually, it's still being refined, I should say, and CBI is helping us bring capacity in that space, and David Plum is working with us. And we're talking about how we build, really not how we talk about what's in the plan, but how we build lasting relationships with communities that we typically aren't able to reach in our engagement, so that we can go deep and work long-term with these communities to educate them about the necessary and ongoing changes that are likely due to the requirements of the GWSA and the transition that we need to see as a state. And that is really exciting, and it's been really great conversations. And since we mentioned Mona earlier, I'll just say she is such a light in those meetings, where she is always like so fed up with how slow we move at the state and it's just like, let's just do it already. And so we're trying to balance doing it thoughtfully and correctly with Mona's interest in action and having us get out there. And so some of those conversations are happening this week. David Plum is meeting with Mona and Mercedes, who Marion can remind me the organization she's with, Mercedes Alvarez, who represents, Marion can remind me, but if not.
Yeah, I'm forgetting, I'll put it in the chat. I can find it in the chat.
Okay, they represent New Americans, and he's also meeting with Amanda and Sue Minter about the application of working with Capstone. We have ongoing, I've been meeting with the Council on Rural Development to think about how they can support engagement and conversations with rural communities as a target. And then David's also having conversations with Beverly and Judy Dow about what an appropriate way to engage with Indigenous communities around this work would be. So stay tuned as that plan gets a little more fleshed out. It's slow to get going, but I do think it'll be lasting and meaningful. And if the climate office is stood up within ANR, that will be a particular focus of that body of work within that office is engagement. Ashka, please, if I messed up anything, you can fix it.
No, you did great, Jane. That's exactly right. So we've all been meeting with David, and some of us haven't met with him yet. I've met with him. We're trying also to put together a document that outlines what we've heard so far in our outreach efforts, so that and a document that is going to be accessible, I would assume, by all subcommittee members and the Climate Council, just to really understand more on a kind of deep roots level what people are saying out there, what's really hurting them. I mean, I think that most of us can what's hurting one is hurting all of it. You know, there are those in rural communities and Indigenous communities that have serious doubts about you know, how the climate action plan is going to be taken forward, and making sure that everything is a just transition and that we're thinking of everyone. So there's a document will be available soon for all to see, and hopefully that will be helpful as well. And thank you so much, Jane. You're absolutely right. All those things are happening today.
And then I'm trying to, I don't remember, apologies if this is just slipping my mind. Do we have a formal liaison with Ag and Ecosystems? Sounds like we've gotten the updates from Rural Resilience and Cross-Sector and Just Transitions, but it may be something to consider as we look at the subcommittee composition going forward and trying to make sure all our bases are covered and ending up with an Ag and Ecosystems subcommittee liaison. Okay.
So I think if there are no other updates or questions for the reporters of those updates, I can hand it over to Jane for more on the measuring and tracking progress tool, RFP.
Thanks, Megan. Just one thing related to Ag and Ecosystems, which is very relevant to science and data, is that as you know, the steering committee is considering how to prioritize those remaining technical assistance funds. The other priority, I would say, that is sort of as developed or moving on a similar path is in the ag emissions space. And so that is we have a set of questions that were developed by Ag and Eco in response to the carbon budget. And those questions didn't need an RFI because we felt like they were ready for an RFP and we've been in pause to think about where the funding would come from for that. And Megan graciously took the lead on applying to U.S. Climate Alliance in the natural and working land space. They have a specific grant that funds work in that sector in hopes of receiving enough funding, $100,000 grant or up to support that RFP. And so that's why we don't have a similar grant opportunity in the life cycle analysis space. And so we're hopeful that we'll have some good indication of that grant prior to the steering committee meeting, but don't yet. But that is something that Ag and Eco is very interested in and continues to push for that to be funded in that space. And just, there is actually another grant that none of the subcommittees led on, but that ANR staff, Dr. Ali Kasiba, who's the climate change forester in FPR, collaborated with numerous other states in the Northeast to put in not a similar grant in the ag space, but for the forest sector to think about how we could better reflect calculations in the forest sector in our understanding and analysis, both in the carbon budget and/or inventory. And so that's ongoing work. So the measuring and assessing progress RFP, just wanted to update you all. That was a task group within science and data that you all helped Jared, Claire, I believe Richard, and I know Colin was very active in, and then Jared, we had support from May Butler, who's the data manager within EAN outside of this sphere, who has a lot of expertise with data. A small group of us met throughout the development of the Climate Action Plan and supported by Cadmus and EFG, who were our technical consultants for the modeling work that was done for the CAP, to develop a framework for what a measuring and assessing progress database would look like as required by the GWSA. And that progress tool would require us to look and track, measure and track data beyond our emissions accounting. So it would need to be very coordinated with the GHG inventory and ensure that we can explain to the public by pulling these policy levers what we expect to see happen in the inventory, and when it doesn't happen in the inventory, try to have a narrative around why it's not being reflected in the inventory, like number of EVs on the road, or number of heat pumps installed, but then a really cold winter, so our heating fuels are still spiking in the inventory or something of that nature. And then so beyond emissions, the database will also look at how we consider and track progress for resilience and adaptation measures in related to the Climate Action Plan and what the correct metrics are to do that. It also, the objectives within the GWSA also speaks to how to track and measure changes to the climate as well as wildlife and biodiversity. And those components we have been thinking about are somewhat covered in the climate assessment, but all of that is required and being thought about within this tool. So that framework, you'll remember, was developed with the support of Cadmus and EFG. You all were able to weigh in on that. Cadmus even went so far as to develop a scope of work for that. But because of the scale and scope of it, it felt not appropriate to amend their contract to develop it, and rather to go out for a new RFP so that we could get a contractor on board that we all feel is the best one to not only support the stakeholder engagement and data governance that needs to happen, but also can take us sort of from start all the way to building it. And we have a robust amount of funding in our GWSA budget to support this, as it is one of the remaining statutory requirements that ANR must move forward in a timely manner. And so I have been working to develop the RFP, and then had great input from Megan and Colin to ensure that as we were developing this, we were also thinking about how we really married it with the greenhouse gas inventory to ensure that communication was clear for the public ultimately, and also thought about opportunities to enhance the greenhouse gas inventory so that that is a more user-friendly tool for both the needs of the statutory requirements as well as the interests of the public in reviewing that. So we have a really solid RFP. It is with Ed McNamara, our general counsel. He has reviewed it and provided some general comments to me just today. And then that meeting I referenced earlier with the Municipal Vulnerability Index, I'm meeting with IT tomorrow to talk about both the RFP for the Municipal Vulnerability Index and the RFP for the Measuring and Assessing Progress, because they both have significant data components and likely database components, and that has concerns and needs to be reviewed and thought about with IT. So hopefully I'll have some more clarity from them on approach and recommendations from them tomorrow, and then we'll be able to move forward in a timely fashion. I will say that at the there's been no meeting of the task group since the climate action plan was adopted in that space, but I anticipate having a cross subcommittee task group that helps us manage that that work going forward. And the RFP speaks a lot to a data governance team that references the subcommittees where it all made sense to touch on, but also referenced relevant state agencies and state employees who should be involved in that. And there's been considerable attention on this tool. I know Jared and I were invited in to talk to the Climate Caucus, who had questions about how you're going to report on this. They didn't seem to remember that they had put in the statute the development of this tool. And so it was good to be able to speak to what the tool would do and wouldn't do. And then there's even been, a lot of conversations with the T-bill about how to track transportation policies and measures and what this tool could do and couldn't do in that space. So yeah, exciting. And I think it's going to be a big component of our work within the agency, advancing this tool going forward in the next year to 2 years. The contract management will be huge, thinking about how we maintain it long-term, manage it. The staff capacity in that space is going to be a lot for us. And while you ask questions and talk about it, I might drop in the chat a link to a really great webinar that Megan and Colin referred Marion and I to, and I've been referring it on to everybody else because that I can think of, because it's a one that shows and illustrates Colorado's measuring and tracking progress tool and what it does and what the inventory does and how the two are different and relate. I think it provides really nice framework for what I think we want to accomplish with ours in Vermont.
Yeah, Jane, I think we're on the same wavelength because I was just going to paste the link to Colorado's dashboard as well. So the webinar will be a great complement to that. But yeah, Colorado's dashboard is up and running. And as Jane says, it not only tracks the greenhouse gas metrics, but also, information about their equity goals and tracking those and community engagement goals as well. So it's a really interesting approach that they've taken. And I think one that, could be a really great model for our thinking and how we want to communicate this information to the public. So Claire and Jared.
Actually related to what Megan just mentioned around the Colorado tool and equity tracking, this actually came up in conversation in Just Transitions last week, talking about, as Koshka mentioned, the subcommittee has been thinking about how to be involved. And there was interest in this particular tool in the implementation section that Just Transitions wrote. They had talked about developing some sort of way to monitor and hold accountable to the guiding principles. And I don't necessarily think it was intended to be this tool, but there were parallels in the two kind of conversations in the fall, and interest in thinking about if that could be incorporated here. And I know, Jane, you had referenced like what we're statutorily required to include, and that in itself is a big lift. But I just wanted to flag that was also of interest to that subcommittee in terms of whether or not there would be participation or regardless, like how monitoring and sort of assessment of equity related progress should be approached moving forward. So
yeah, that's a really great reminder. I think my heart was stopping during that conversation because I was starting to feel like it was going to be the tool to measure and track progress and for everything, and felt anxious about that. But I do think it's really good for us to be mindful about where there's opportunities there to consider that in the tool, and where we can't or may fall short, think about where else we can be ensuring that's happening, because it is called for in the plan and very important.
Jared, you're on mute.
So I just want to thank you, Jane, for that update and all the work that's gone into building on those conversations that the Measuring and Tracking Progress task group had. And I know that there's a lot of different important considerations, both in terms of Global Warming Solutions Act and different subcommittees and different state agencies. I think it's great that there's a draft RFP and that A&R General Counsel is reviewing that. I guess the question I would have from a process and timeline perspective is, because we do want to make sure that anything that we feel like is critical to be measuring and tracking is properly addressed in that RFP. And I know we've had a number of conversations about this as a subcommittee already, but I think you were right, Jane, that it will be important to broaden that group to get some different perspectives. I'm just wondering about kind of a kind of final review and kind of feedback opportunity before the RFP would go live. I just hate to have a situation where it's the responses we get might miss something that otherwise would have brought up if there was one more chance to look at that, either from that task group or an expanded task group. So want to see what if you've already discussed that, or if not, if we could build that into the process and timeline. I think that would be very helpful.
Yeah, Julie, you go first.
Sure. I just offer, I mean, I think there will be a bit of an evolution as we move through the building of this tool. I anticipate fully that we're not going to have a completely and truly comprehensive scope when we initially put out the RFP, and ultimately we'll need to amend the contract because there will be some learning as we go. And so appreciate the question you're asking, Jared, but just also I think it's important to keep in mind that while we need to do a good and thoughtful and comprehensive job building this initial RFP, I think it's unrealistic to think we will have such a significant undertaking that ultimately doesn't need to be amended as we move through the work and see, frankly, the work products and kind of what the art of the possible is in building out a tool that hopefully will serve us well for a decade or more to come.
Yeah, and I guess you're right to bring this up, Jared. I also just feel like the framework of which the RFP is built on very much was a collaborative process and was clearly put into the cap. And so as such, so it felt like for me, like a clear marching directive to draft the RFP and move that forward. And but then would ensure that the group would come together to, before we would pull the group together to ensure that the right folks are around the table to review the proposals that come in.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess and if I'm the only person on this, then that's fine. I fully agree with what Julie said, that, over time there will likely need to be amendments and changes based on what we're learning and what those work products are. I'm just thinking back to other examples of when we've either drafted RFIs or RFPs, and oftentimes there has been whether it was the initial RFP that led to the contracts with Cadmus and EFG, or the RFIs that went out on life cycle, there was an opportunity for task groups to just look at those before they went out, and so that hopefully that number of amendments and changes will be lower than it may otherwise have had to be. And I trust that it's going to be very comprehensive and high quality, but I think that if it can fit in the timeline, it would be a best practice and fitting with that other precedent to allow kind of folks who've participated in those discussions or who have kind of a specific kind of interest or expertise from some of the council subcommittees to give it a look. I think that would be beneficial. But I totally agree also that, some of that will need to happen coming together afterwards, and responses are done and we're building out a scope of work and what that data governance team is and the other components.
And just so you know, I fully appreciate that that's the process we followed. And the only reason this is slightly out of step or different is because it was a very different process to get to the RFP here, in that the framework, we essentially worked as a task group with the consultant that we had on board to build what would be the RFP through that framework and scope of services that we did all collectively work on. So it wasn't like I was starting from scratch. I was picking up the work of that was in the plan. And so that I just wanted to acknowledge that that's the only reason why it feels a little different, or I handled it differently, mostly because it had felt so collaborative to this point. And so I guess and I'm not opposed to having folks review it before it goes out. I will just wait and see I'm cautious because have a bit of concern of what's going to happen with ADS tomorrow. So why don't I wait and just sort of update folks after I meet with ADS to see what they're going to recommend or guide me to do.
Thanks, Jane.
All right, I think if there's nothing else on the measuring and tracking progress RFP, then we'll move on to subcommittee membership and updates, and then the nomination process. And Jared is going to cover this item.
Great. So there was I'm going to forget the exact dates, but the nomination period was open for, I believe it was about a month. And we ended up, so right now, correct me if I'm wrong, by my count, we have 9 subcommittee members in science and data. We had identified going in some gaps or some areas of expertise or experience that we thought would be really valuable. Some others were surfaced in the nomination process that people said, this is the experience or perspective that I would like to bring. I think that Marion had shared that generally the target we have used in terms of keeping subcommittees both kind of broad and diverse, but also manageable in size has been kind of around a max of 12. So if we're looking at that, it's probably looking to add about 3 members. Some of the specific things that we asked for nominees around were experience and expertise related to resilience metrics, economics, life cycle emissions, and then there were some other areas that came up in the nomination. We ended up, correct me if I'm wrong, Marion, my understanding is we ended up having 10 different nominees for the Science and Data Subcommittee. We didn't post those publicly because there's a bunch of kind of personal identification information in terms of emails and phone numbers. I am happy to I think it's okay, unless somebody shakes their head otherwise, to share the list of who the nominees received are, especially if you are one of those nominees and want to make sure that you're not that your materials were received. But in terms of process, when Megan and I met ahead of this meeting, we had basically realized that we hadn't fully fleshed out a proposed process to review those nominations, and then have a recommendation made about new subcommittee members, which would so our recommendation that would love to get your feedback on is that we set up a small kind of review committee that would review all those nominations that came in, look at the kind of identified and other kind of surfaced criteria to consider and put forward a slate of proposed nominees to join the subcommittee for your consideration. That would first be a subcommittee decision, and then if the subcommittee agrees, that would go to the steering committee for final review and approval. I believe that Megan and I are both willing to review those nominees, and I think we would ask if it's amenable to other folks for up to 2 other people to join us in that process, and then we could meet as a kind of a smaller review group between meetings and plan to come to the next full Science and Data Subcommittee meeting with a recommendation.
That sounds fine to me. Are you going to show us the list today?
I don't have it written up. I can read it out, and then Marion, if you don't mind just double checking and making sure I haven't missed somebody from the list that we have. So the nominations received, and I'm pausing in case there's any reason that I shouldn't share this list, but I think it's totally public and fine to share the nominees that came in, right? Jane, Julie, okay, good. So the nominees received, some were nominated by others, some were self-nominated. I'm not going to distinguish that here, just going to go through the list. Catherine Lothar, Henry Amistadi, George Gross, Tara Kulkarni, Anna Suberling, David Westman, Adam Sherman, Ken Jones, Jillian Galford, and Emma Spett. And I think it's fair to say that of those criteria we identified, there are one or more nominees who identified as being their areas of experience, expertise, lived experience, that didn't seem to me that there was an obvious gap in terms of what we were looking for and a lack of nominees in those areas. So I think that's good. So I think the question is feedback on that proposed process, and if it sounds good to folks, would open the floor to kind of volunteers to work with Megan and I to more carefully review and dig in on that ahead of the next meeting.
Jared, I had volunteered a couple meetings back to assist with that. I'm not sure if that missed being in the minutes somewhere. And then the other piece that I had recommended was trying to flesh out folks like Jared Olmo or David Grass for their ability to participate and bring some of the additional health pieces to the conversation. So just wanted to flag that and have it on the record.
Yeah, if I could just build on that, I think there's also just sort of I don't know, a little bit of an oddity with state staff being in the nomination pool, and very much to your point, Leslie Ann, I think reaching out to engage some of those folks is appropriate, and it may just be that state staff should be in their own kind of separate space from folks from sort of general public that's expressed interest in joining the committee, because I don't think we do that same sort of solicitation necessarily of broad public members.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Julie.
I did just want to note that Marion reminded me that the Department of Health staff that you just referenced, Leslie Ann, they actually did nominate themselves, but they were nominated for a different subcommittee right now. They nominated themselves to support rural resilience and adaptation.
Is that this time around again, Jane, or was that the last time around?
No, this time.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I was going to say that process sounds fine and similar to Leslie, and I think I had also been volunteered, and I'm happy to continue onward to support the group to do that.
That sounds like a great group. If that sounds good to others. I would note, Secretary Moore, to go back to your point on the question of state staff, I do think that there is a difference between somebody who is a designee of a council member and therefore participating as a full subcommittee member, like in the way that Claire is or Megan is. And then of course we also have staff support, but I do think that those are different roles, and it's helpful to probably be clear for subcommittee composition and for staffing which of those we're looking at, and would totally agree that if there was, for instance, a reason that there was an interested staff person who wasn't like a full subcommittee member, we could look at that staffing role. But I do think that now that we're beyond the initial formation of the subcommittee stage, during which council members and or their designees were able to express interest, and that first group of nominations has passed, my sense is that it would be appropriate that state staff who are interested in being full subcommittee members as designees of counselors would go through that nomination and selection process. But if they did not kind of end up in a position as members of the subcommittee, could and of course would be welcome to serve in the state staff support role. That's just my sense, but would welcome other thoughts or feedback on
that. I should absolutely know the answer to this question, but I don't think they are. But the commissioner of health is not a council member. Is that correct?
That's correct. They are not.
So Jared or David would not be able to serve in that kind of designee role then.
That's right. Yeah, they wouldn't. Right. There would be no one for them to serve as a designee of.
Right.
I'm trying to think off the top of my head if we have examples of other state staff who are members of subcommittees who are not designees. I'll have to check the membership list, but to see whether that's the case in other subcommittees.
Okay. So
Also wanted to just, Marion, you had suggested offline that the other subcommittees in considering nominations, and I think you had used Just Transitions as an example, had kind of taken the time to pose some questions for the smaller group to kind of consider as they were talking about nominations, to kind of like charge the group with some questions. And I was wondering if you could maybe explain that a little bit more for this subcommittee, and so we could consider maybe doing something similar.
Sure. I think part of it is pulling on, I believe, conversations you all had before we posted the nomination form, but revisiting that conversation around what are those areas of expertise and or lived experience that the subcommittee members currently think would be helpful to add, understanding that, you all are at 9 members, you likely won't be able to sort of extend invitations to all, 12 or so folks who nominated themselves or others. So I think if you all had time and wanted to revisit sort of the thoughts around what are missing voices at the table, or what would be helpful to have in terms of experience or lived experiences, expertise or lived experience, so that the small group of folks looking at nominations can have that fresh in mind as they look at that list.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And so the questions that you had sent previously, I know you just kind of alluded to them, but I'll state them again, and maybe I'll cut and paste them here and put them in the chat. But what areas of expertise or lived experience would be helpful to add to the subcommittee? What voices do you think have been missing from subcommittee conversations? And then which of these areas of expertise or lived experience should be a priority to add to the subcommittee? So I'll put that in the chat as examples.
And again, we did list some in the nomination, so I can put those in the chat as well.
Sure.
To start the conversation, but I think, for the small group to have an understanding of what the larger subcommittee thinks would be valuable, I think could only be helpful for those conversations.
Agreed. And I would agree that I think those are the primary considerations. I think it could also be helpful to go back and look at some of the published broader criteria that we used at the very beginning of the nomination process, that looked at like, as long as those primary criteria are met, I think there is a desire to make sure that there's a level of geographic diversity, of you know, racial and gender diversity. You know, there's other things that may kind of you know, be considerations, as long as the core considerations of around those criteria that we've listed in terms of expertise or experience are met. And I'm remembering those as, in the list I had seen, was around resilience metrics, economics, and life cycle emissions. But if there are others, please add those so that small group can consider them. Claire.
Yeah, and well, if I was quick enough in my email, I would have just looked this up. But in terms of work planning as well, I just trying to remember what else is on the agenda for the subcommittee. I know obviously the monitoring and everything we talked about today, the monitoring assessment tool, the life cycle analysis task group, the municipal vulnerability task group. But I guess, is there anything not currently active that we would need to be doing that we may want to be looking for expertise related to? The answer might be no. I just couldn't remember if there are other areas of the work plan from last year that we didn't get to.
I do think it's great to surface anything now. I'd also say if there's additional thoughts, feel free to email Megan and I. I'm happy to work with Megan and then Dr. Dupini-Giroux and Claire to schedule a meeting and then let folks know when we'll be meeting. So if there are any additional thoughts that come up between now and then, you could email Megan and I to share with that small group. Just trying to avoid the discussion by list.
That sounds great. Thank you, Jared. I think anything else on nominations and subcommittee membership? All right. I think then we have a good chunk of time for public comment today, if there's any public comments. All right. Oh, George, go ahead.
Afternoon. The comments have been, folks. Looking at the RFI responses, I had some observations about them. I don't know at what point in the future you will be taking a harder look at them. One thing that became apparent in comparing them is there was an absence of discussion of biogenic life cycle emissions for biofuels and the land use and indirect land use aspects of that problem space. Also, no mention or deep assessment of ISO New England's energy mix and the emissions that are in that realm. I imagine that if they were to start the work program, they would certainly get into that. But it was conspicuous to me that they focused mostly on petroleum fuels, which are kind of well established and fairly high levels of certainty. Another piece that was missing in the RFI responses was a discussion of uncertainty in the assessment models. The techniques one uses for that have a lot of fuzziness. Sometimes they have to buy or find somehow proprietary data when the corporations are not willing to voluntarily provide the kind of information you might need. So those were sort of key aspects of that. What else? None of the responses seem to discuss global warming potential on a 100-year time horizon versus some of the other metrics that are available. The data sets that they cited to, like at the EPA, I believe, are all based on a carbon dioxide equivalent, use the global warming potential at 100-year. And there's a pretty emergence, a fairly strong consensus in the climate science community that has some risk in policymaking because of the inherent tension between short-term and long-term climate forcing gases. And with that, there's, I think, a reason to want to have that recognized as part of the inventory that you develop in the future with one of these candidates, if you were to choose to do that. And that's all I had to say. Thanks.
Thank you, George. Agreed. Very helpful.
Any other public comment? All right. I guess we could talk for a moment about intentions for meeting next. I think there's a few questions in terms of, what might help lead or prioritize our immediate workload. Thinking specifically about, potential next steps with the life cycle RFP. Obviously, we need to understand what the steering committee is going to decide on in terms of funding at their meeting in early April. And as I had mentioned earlier, I think our work around getting an initial draft of an RFP to review will be based on that decision. So I guess we could maybe, Jared, we could look to schedule a meeting when timing seemed appropriate in terms of reviewing a draft of that RFP, similar to kind of how we worked with the RFI draft, where it was, we had an initial draft, the task group had a first cut at editing it, and then it was shared with the entire subcommittee. So I guess I would propose that we base the timing of our next meeting off of all of that work, if the steering committee makes that funding decision.
I think we also want to make sure we have the time for the task group on the nominations to review and consider. So I think that I'm kind of hopefully we could meet again in a month, but I could also see that depending on how long it takes to draft the RFP and for that task group, I don't want to meet for the sake of meeting. I want to be able to meet with some updates and some recommendations. So, maybe that gets, pushed to late April or first week of May or something, but hopefully we can, I think we had agreed that generally we want to try to be on a kind of monthly meeting time frame.
Sure.
So I guess the question would be whether we want to just wait and ask folks to stay tuned, or whether we want to just kind of pencil in a save the date for now. And Jane and Marion, I'd look to you as I think we had some conversations by email about timing, and we had identified that while no time is perfect, that this general, especially after seeing Leslie Ann and Jay's schedule, that this, correct me if I'm wrong, Jay, that this kind of Wednesday afternoon time was better than most. So we could tentatively hold something like, the 27th. I am noticing that I have a conflict. I have a commitment until 2:30. Or we could even look to the next week just to give us ourselves a little bit more time, like Wednesday, May 4th.
Yeah, that May 4th might make sense, Jared, just because I think I know I'm going to be away during April school vacation week, which is right before the 27th there. And I think a few others may as well. And And so having, the week following that vacation week to regroup and kind of get organized would lead to, I think, us being well prepared to meet again on the 4th of May.
Makes sense. I think that sounds good.
Yeah.
Others agree? So let's pencil in 2 to 4 on Wednesday, May 4th then.
Okay. Does that
just
work for
wanna
you,
make
Jane?
Oh, yeah, it works for me. Thank you. But just wanted to make sure that if the steering committee approves the funding for the life cycle analysis, that if what we're saying is that we would need to have the subcommittee come back together to approve the RFP before it would be posted. So just want to acknowledge that if that's what I was just hearing you say, that RFP then wouldn't get posted till May.
Jane, we would need to look at the budget too and make sure we have money and moving pieces. Some of that may be part of our 23 budget. I don't think we've, Megan ran for us sort of the full list of funding, but some of that money is FY23 money that isn't available till after July 1st.
Yeah, totally. Appreciate that.
Yeah,
Assuming though, we just want to say, assuming if we have money, which in the fiscal year 22 budget, we probably want to advance it. But I think it's fine to wait. I just wanted to make sure that we were acknowledging that.
Yeah, and just the other piece in there is the business offices of state government generally shut down for the month of June, so that they can run year end, and that we may run up against that regardless. So there's some constraints on our end just in terms of how quickly we'll be able to move this out, almost regardless of the flavor of the money, should it ultimately be prioritized by the steering committee.
I do think though that if that funding is approved, that it would be good to convene that task group soon to review a draft, so that like when we do have a subcommittee meeting, it is with a kind of a draft with a recommendation, so it would be ready to go unless there were kind of major questions or concerns.
Yeah, and I think that timing would work, given the pause we're all likely going to be taking during that week in April for school vacation. So I think we could try, Jared, to meet with that task group prior to the vacation week to review comments.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so we'll shoot for that. Any other business?
So that would be likely the week of April 11th, Megan, right? Is that what
Yes.
you're posting for the-
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
All sounds good to me.
Yep.
Anything else, anybody? Good to see you all. Thank
Yeah.
you for all your work.
Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone.
Thanks. Bye.